Hey guys, by Austin Ramos, and today we're going to be talking about the Miami Dolphins' fourth quarter of the season review. And just a little forewarning, it did not end well. So let's kick it off with leading up to that point. The Miami Dolphins were 8-4, having a pretty good season up to that point. They had just come off of I believe, a 5-game winning streak, and things were looking really good for them. Uh, at a 5-game winning streak, the last one, and then 1-2 in a row. And then they face the big bad wolf in the AFC, and that is the Kansas City Chiefs. Dolphins did not end well in that game. Came close, and that was pretty good because that showed the type of team the Dolphins were. They were a very competitive team at that point, and final score, as you can see on the scoreboard above me, is 33-27, and unfortunately Miami lost that game. They had a little comeback, just wasn't the best case scenario. uh, Receivers getting hurt, a lot of skill position players getting hurt, and still the Dolphins mounted some kind of comeback. But Patrick Mahomes and Kansas City Chiefs, they're just too good offensively. Defensively, they're pretty good too. So kudos to those Chiefs, and they are the number one seed in the AFC, and they earned it. They are 12, no, 14-2 at. But at this point, they were 12-1. Dolphins were 8-5, and looking to continue their rise because they were having a pretty good season up to that point. Dolphins jump out to an early lead, 10-0, and then Kansas City comes back and takes the lead right before halftime, 14-10. And then Chiefs go on a run, put about 21, 28, 30 into the third quarter. And then the Dolphins start coming back, 17-24. Then Chiefs answer a field goal, 33-24. Dolphins kick a field goal, 27-33. That's the final score. Dolphins tried recovering an onside kick at that point, but at that point it was a little too late. And I went over this game. I went over each and every one of these games I'm going to mention, but I just want to just highlight some of the things, key stats. Patrick Mahomes went 24 for 34, 393 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. That was the most he's had. I don't know if as a professional, if that's the most interceptions he's thrown in a game. I'm pretty sure it's up there. And he was sacked 3 times for a loss of 39 yards. I mean, that first half was not very good for Patrick Mahomes, which was working in the Dolphins' favor. But as you guys know, as of late, there's no lead is safe with the Kansas City Chiefs. And Tua had a pretty good game himself. 28 completions for 48 attempts, 316 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. He was sacked 4 times for a loss of 29 yards, which was kind of a downfall in that game. And that was something that really hurt the Dolphins. Tyreek Hill, the receivers, I'm sorry, I was looking at their rushing stats. Their leading rusher was their second leading receiver. Tyreek Hill had 1 carry for 32 yards and a touchdown. Clyde Edwards-Helaire didn't really do much. He had 16 carries for 32 yards. Dolphins, not much else going on the running game. DeAndre Washington had 13 carries for 35 yards, so it wasn't too crazy. But we traded for him from Kansas City earlier in the season, so I'm pretty sure he wanted to get in real bad. And luckily, it was that was the case because the Dolphins were down their top 2 running backs at that point. Let's go to receiving. Travis Kelce had 8 receptions for 136 yards, 1 touchdown. Next leading receiver, Tyreek Hill, 3 receptions, 79 yards, and 1 touchdown. The rest of the receivers did pretty good, but let's talk about the Dolphins. Lynn Bolden Jr. had the leading receptions for the Dolphins, 7 receptions, 82 yards. Mac Hollins was next, 5 receptions, 66 yards. And then Mike Gesicki, 5 receptions, 65 yards, 2 touchdowns. Now, when you look at some of the turnovers, the Dolphins had Cameron Grugier-Hill recovered a fumble that Byron Jones forced, and which was great. Byron Jones also fumbled one, and he recovered it himself, I believe, when he did the interception, which I'll talk about in a bit. Mecole Hardman fumbled it when Byron Jones punched it out. Cameron Grugier-Hill recovered it, and then Patrick Mahomes had a fumble that I think went out of bounds. Key defensive players from this game, L'Jarius Sneed was the Chiefs' leading tackler, 8 total, 7 solo. And let's just jump over to the Dolphins. Jerome Baker had 9 total tackles, 5 solo, 2.5 sacks, and 3 QB hits. And Christian Wilkins had the other half sack with him. And it was good. It was a pretty good game between both teams. Interceptions, Tyrann Mathieu had an interception, returned for 5 yards. And that shouldn't have been an interception. Not saying he didn't earn it or anything, but deep ball to Jakeem Grant, couldn't catch it, pops up, and then at that point, Tyrann Mathieu's there to catch the ball. Dolphins, though, had 3 interceptions. Eric Rowe had an interception, return for 22 yards. Byron Jones had a return for 15 yards on an interception. And then Xavier Howard had probably one of the nicest interceptions of the year. One-hand grab while defending Tyreek Hill, going into the end zone. I mean, that was probably one of the nicest interceptions of the whole year that I've seen from not only Xavier Howard, from a lot of the players. Kenny Moore had a really good one, I think the same week, if I'm not mistaken, against the Raiders. And those are the top 2 interceptions I've seen this season. So when we go over some other key stats, kicking-wise, Harrison Butker went 1 for 1 field goal, 4 for extra point. Jason Sanders went 2 for 3 on field goals, 3 for 3 on extra points. That field goal doesn't prove to be the difference, but it hurt the Dolphins. Most definitely. It was unfortunate. That was not a good game for the Dolphins, running into the Chiefs like that. Next, we have the Patriots game where the Dolphins won. They beat the New England Patriots 12-22, and this put the Dolphins at 9-5, and the Patriots dropped down to 6-8. And I mean, it wasn't too crazy of a game. Not the best offensive game for both teams. Dolphins, though, almost had 400 total yards. Patriots just barely got 300. Let's look at Cam Newton. Had 209 passing yards for 17 completions for 27 attempts. He had no touchdowns, no interceptions. He was sacked 3 times for a loss of 23 yards. Tua had 20 for 26, 145 yards, 1 interception, 2 sacks for a loss of 12 yards. Sonny Michel was the Patriots' leading rusher, 10 carries, 74 yards. Savon Ahmed had a pretty good game. He had 23 carries, 122 yards, 1 touchdown. And then Tua had 2 rushing touchdowns as well. Matt Breida was not too far off from Savon Ahmed, 12 carries for 86 yards. Receiving, Jacoby Myers led the Patriots with 7 receptions, 111 yards. James White was next, 4 receptions, 52 yards. Dolphins, Durham Smythe was the leading receiver, 5 receptions, 40 yards. Lynn Bolden Jr. was next, 6 receptions, 37 yards. I mean, it was not too crazy of a passing game for the Dolphins that week. Patriots had fumbles on fumbles. So Jacoby Myers fumbled one, and Orlando Roberts recovered it. And then Cam Newton and Dalton Lee both fumbled the balls, but they went out of bounds. Now, let's look at defensive stats. Trez Hall had 13 total tackles, 11 solo. And then let's look, Adrian Phillips had a sack. And it's about the key stats I want to mention for the Patriots. Dolphins, Orlando Roberts had 9 total tackles, 5 solo. And Jerome Baker had a sack. So did Zach Sealer and Emmanuel Ogba. Now let's go to interceptions. J.C. Jackson was the one who got the interception off of Tua. He had a return of 5 yards. This was in the end zone. This was early on in the game. And kicking, let's go to kicking. We have Nick Folk went 4 for 4 on field goals. And then no extra points because they didn't score a touchdown. And then Jason Sanders missed a field goal and went 2 for 2 on extra points. So not too crazy of a game. Not too much was happening here. Low scoring game, which I kind of anticipated it was going to be a heavily running game. That's what the Patriots offense has been this season, and that's what the Dolphins wanted to focus on in this game. Let's move on to week 16, which was probably one of the most, I don't know how to say it, like the most electric Dolphins game of the year. They ended up winning in the last literally second, 26-25. thank God that the Vegas Raiders kicker missed an extra point, because if not, the game would have been tied and probably would have went into overtime. This was a game that eliminated the Raiders from playoff contention and kept the Dolphins' hopes alive. Because if they would have lost, it would have opened up the door for the Raiders, but both teams would have been the two teams in the hunt. But after that week, it put the Dolphins at the 5th seed, which was very exciting for a brief moment in time. You'll see why I mentioned that later on. But the game wasn't too crazy. Tua did not have a great game. He had 17 completions for 22 yards, 22 attempts, 94 yards, 1 touchdown. Then at some point, Fitzpatrick comes in late in the game and leads the Dolphins' comeback. 9 completions of 13 attempts, 182 yards, 1 touchdown. And by the way, Tua was sacked 3 times for a loss of 23 yards. Derek Carr didn't have a bad game himself. He had 21 completions for 34 attempts, 336 yards, 1 touchdown, and was sacked 3 times for a loss of 22 yards. Now, leading rusher for the game was Myles Gaskin, 14 carries, 87 yards. Next for the Raiders was Josh Jacobs. He had 13 carries for 69 yards. And then receiving-wise, Myles Gaskin was also a leading receiver. 5 receptions, 82 yards, 2 touchdowns. And his touchdown, the second touchdown he received, was probably the biggest one of the game. Broke a tackle, went upfield, got a big block by Matt Collins, who also made a big play later on in the game. Matt Collins was the 4th leading receiver. He had a 34-yard reception that set up the game, especially with Fitzpatrick's face mask being called at additional 15 yards to the play, which set the Dolphins in field goal range. Next play, they just killed clock and then ended up kicking the field goal. Trying to do a time expiring, it didn't happen. 1 second left. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But, yeah. Myles Gaskin, leading receiver. Mike Gesicki was next, 4 receptions, 54 yards. Raiders, Nelson Aguilar had 5 receptions, 155 yards, 1 touchdown. Next was Darren Waller, 5 receptions, 112 yards. But they did not beat the Dolphins so much on passing. The passing hurt the Dolphins, but it did not beat them. Clayton Fejeldum had a fumble recovery also off of Keeson Nixon, which was on the last play of the game, the kickoff return to close out the game. They were passing it around, trying to make something happen, and then at the end he fumbles it, which extended the Dolphins' turnover streak to, at that point, I think it was 22 games. Now, let's talk about leading tacklers. Jerome Baker had 10 total tackles, 7 solo, 1 sack, 1 tackle for a loss. Andrew Van Ginkel had 2 sacks. And that was about it defensively. Andrew Van Ginkel also had a pass deflection, which was big. Next, for the Raiders, Corey Littleton had 9 total tackles, 8 solo. Raekwon McMillan, former Dolphin, had 9 total tackles, 7 solo. And Jonathan Hankins had 1 sack, and so did Carl Nassib and Kendall Vickers. So, not so good there. So, no interceptions. Let's go to punt returns. Hunter Renfrow had a nice punt return for 32 yards. But overall, he had 5 total punt returns for 61 yards. And then Jason Sanders went perfect on the day, 4 for 4 kicking field goals and 2 for 2 on extra points. Pretty much the same thing for Daniel Carlson for the Raiders, but he went 4 for 4 on field goals and 1 for 2 on extra points, which proved to be the difference in this game. And so, with that being said, kept the Dolphins' playoff hopes alive, put them at the 5th seed, which is the highest wild card non-divisional winner seed that you could get. But ran into a brick wall up in Buffalo against the Buffalo Bills, losing 26-56, which was very disappointing. And the Dolphins, essentially, you win, you're automatically in. You don't have to worry about anyone else. Just do your job, get the win, get out, and focus on the next game. That doesn't happen. What happens next? The Dolphins were hoping for either Browns, the Cleveland Browns, Baltimore Ravens, or the Indianapolis Colts to lose. Due to the Tennessee Titans having the same record but having the tiebreaker over the Dolphins, that automatically secured the Tennessee Titans spot in the playoffs. All they needed to do was win to win the division. But if they lost, the Colts win the division. Complicated stuff there. But point is, Dolphins needed one of those three teams earlier mentioned to lose after this point, after losing. Didn't happen, and it's upsetting as a Dolphins fan. So close, just so close. It's like that meme of the guy. I forgot what commercial exactly what it was, like what for what brand, but guy's like has $1 on a string and he's fishing and he just gotta be quicker than that, and it's a constant meme, especially when it came to like championships and like other teams. I think that happened. Remember when the Heat won the championship against San Antonio Spurs, and that meme was around, but not the best game for the Dolphins. When you look at the box score, you'd be like, okay, this was a close game. Nope, not at all. The problem with the Dolphins, they were not efficient with their drives in this game, and that really cost them. I go more into depth in each and every one of these games in my own separate post-game reviews, and I will link each and every one in here, but let's talk about this game. Tua went 35 for 58, 361 yards, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions, and at least for sure 2 of the 3 were not his fault. 2 of the 3 hit the receiver's hands, bounce out, defenders catch it. And then the other one was straight to Josh Norman's hands. Devontae Parker slips and falls on his route. Josh Norman's right there to receive it. It is what it is. Josh Allen had 18 completions for 25 attempts, 224 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. And then Matt Barkley had 6 completions for 13 attempts, 164 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. And leading rusher for the Dolphins was Savon Ahmed, 6 carries, 29 yards. Tua was right behind them, 6 carries, 28 yards. Savon Ahmed also had a touchdown. Buffalo Bills, Antonio Williams had 12 carries for 63 yards and 2 touchdowns. Those were late touchdowns, so he did the most of the chewing the clock for the Bills. Dolphins' leading receiver was Devontae Parker, 7 total receptions with 116 yards. Gabriel Davis was the Bills' leading receiver, 2 receptions for 107 yards, 1 touchdown. And then Stephon Diggs was next, 7 receptions for 76 yards. And then I'll just list off the other 2 guys that killed the Dolphins. John Brown, 4 receptions, 72 yards, 1 touchdown. And then Isaiah McKenzie had 6 receptions, 65 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Both of those touchdowns were in the red zone. And so let's talk about fumbles. Matt Collins fumbled the ball, and Harrison Phillips recovered it. And then Malcolm Perry fumbled one and went out of bounds. Next, defensive key stats. Eric Rowe had 7 total tackles, 5 solo. Andrew Van Ginkel had 1 sack, 3 tackles for a loss, 1 pass deflection. Besides that, the stat sheet is pretty empty for the Dolphins besides tackles. Tremaine Edmonds was the Bills' leading tackler. 9 total tackles, 5 solo, 1 sack, 1 tackle for a loss. And let's see, Josh Norman had 2 pass deflections. Dane Jackson had a tackle for a loss and 2 pass deflections. Let's talk about interceptions. Xavier Howard had a interception returned for 6 yards, and then Byron Jones had a really nice interception early on in the game, returned for 0 yards because he caught it on the boundary and dragged his toe. And I mean, it was a masterpiece of an interception by him, but at the end of the day, they're not talking about that. They're talking about how bad the Bills beat the Dolphins. The Bills' interceptions. Dean Marlowe had 2 interceptions for return for 39 yards, and then Josh Norman had an interception return for 16 yards and a touchdown. Unfortunate. So, punt return. Isaiah McKenzie had 1 punt return for 84 yards and a touchdown. That was the one that pretty much sealed the nail in the coffin for the Dolphins at that point. They were still close. It was still like a 21-3 game, but that one was just like the one that broke the camel's back. Because honestly, Dolphins really didn't have a chance to win the game after that point. The Bills just kept on stacking it on them. Let's talk about kicking. Jason Sanders went 2 for 2 on field goals, and then longest was 49, 2 for 2 on extra points. Tyler Bass had only extra points. He went 8 for 8. And that pretty much sums it up for the Miami Dolphins when it comes to their fourth quarter of the season. Let's talk about some of the bright sides of the Dolphins season. The Dolphins went 10-6, a lot higher than a lot of people projected. I wouldn't say a lot higher. People probably projected the Dolphins at max probably to win 9 games, And that was a lot of people who were optimistic on the Dolphins. A lot of people were kind of, I don't know, they won 5 games, but let's see what happens this year. And so they kind of downplayed them. And a lot of people do that, especially like the big names and like ESPN and all that stuff, just so they kind of cover their own ass. They don't want to go out too far, but they want to, leave the bait there. And it is what it is. Xavier Howard was named the Dolphins MVP, and then Fitzpatrick was the Leadership Award. Bob McCain, Ed Block, Courage Award, and then a bunch of guys, Christian Wilkins, Cal Van Noy, Patrick Laird, Byron Jones, and there was someone else that were big community help this season. Now let's talk about who the Dolphins have signed as future reserve contracts. QB Reed Sinnett, tight end Chris Merrick, defensive ends Nick Coy and Tyrone Render, cornerbacks Javarius Davis and Tino Ellis, safety Brian Cole, linebacker Kylan Johnson, center Tyler Gutierrez, offensive tackle Jonathan Hubbard, guard Duval Guñeros Nieto, and I think he can be available to come onto the Dolphins roster this season. So we'll see what happens. He was part of a program. Basically, he had to stay on the practice squad for like 2 years, 3 years, I think. Not too sure, but he's going to be able to come onto the team this season. So let's see what happens with that. Long snapper Rex Shinera, and that is it for the reserved future contracts. Let's talk about the team's leading statistical leaders. Ryan Fitzpatrick led the team with 2,091 passing yards, 13 touchdowns. He had a QBR of 78.4. Myles Gaskin had 584 rushing yards on the year on 142 carries, 3 touchdowns. Devontae Parker had 793 yards, 63 receptions, and 4 touchdowns. Now, defensively, Jerome Baker led the team with tackles, 112. He had 7 sacks, which was really good. Great job by Jerome Baker. Manuel Agba led the team in sacks with 9. He had 42 total tackles. And then Xavier Howard had 10 interceptions, which is first time in a while that a defender had 10 interceptions in a year. And he had 20 pass deflections and then 51 total tackles. And that pretty much sums up the Dolphins' season. They averaged about 233 passing yards, which was 20th in the league. Rushing yards, 105.5, which was 22nd in the league. And then points for, which is points they average in the year, 25.3, which was 15th. And then points against was 21.1, which is 27th. Going into last Sunday's game, they were averaging 18 points defensively in the whole year. And then now they averaged 21 after that big loss. So let's talk about draft picks. Dolphins hold 2 draft picks. One of them is a 3rd pick overall. The second one is 18th overall pick. And it's really nice. It's really nice to see Dolphins have 2 picks here. They also have 2 picks in the second round. But what I have here is not showing up. But Dolphins have draft capital. They have a lot of cap space going into next season. And then on top of all of that, they have people who they probably gauged their interest to come to Miami to play. So things are looking bright for the Dolphins. Went 10-6 in the year. Did not close out the season the way they wanted to. The Kansas City Chiefs game, not that you're expecting a loss there, but they are the best team in the NFL. You kind of got to expect that it's going to be a tough game. It's going to be close. They don't know for sure if they're going to win. That Bills game, it was unfortunate. Bills were fighting for the 2nd seed. And turns out they would have got it regardless if they lost. But besides that, it's still puts the Dolphins in a bad position because they got pretty much booted out of the playoffs. So it is what it is. That pretty much sums up the Dolphins' 2020 4th quarter of the season review and pretty much the whole season. It was a good ride. It was fun while it lasted. It's unfortunate that it ends here. And that's all I pretty much got to say. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. And if you did, make sure to give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the post notification bell if you haven't done it yet. And also follow me on Twitter and Instagram @ByAustinRamos. And last but not least, fin up.